Morning, everyone.
Morning.
While House Democrats are working to grow the middle class and drive down the high cost of living in the United States of America, Republicans continue to betray the middle class. Last year, all we heard from House Republicans is how they were going to drive down the high cost of living in the United States of America. Housing costs are too high, grocery costs are too high, child care costs are too high, utility costs are too high, and insurance costs are too high. America is undoubtedly too expensive. House Democrats are committed to driving down the high cost of living. Republicans haven't done a thing to address the cost of living crisis in the United States of America. Not a single bill, not a single proposal, not a single idea. And the Congress started on January 3rd. What are they waiting for at this point in time? The reality is House Republicans and Donald Trump and Senate Republicans have no interest in bringing down the high cost of living. Costs aren't going down, they are going up. The price of eggs in the United States of America is out of control. It's an emergency, and nothing is being done by the Republicans in Washington or across the country to address it. Questions?
Thank you. There's a government funding deadline on March 14th. How would you characterize the appropriations talks right now, and do you feel that Republicans are still actively engaging, or have they walked away?
House Republicans have the majority. Senate Republicans have the majority. Donald Trump is the president. They have a responsibility to fund the government on March 14th. Over the last several weeks, House Democrats, led by Rosa DeLauro, have been engaging in good faith in trying to reach an agreement that meets the needs of the American people, keeps the government open, and addresses issues around the health, the safety, the national security, and the economic well-being of everyday Americans. House Republicans have chosen to walk away.
Torian with CBS News. Speaker Johnson said that you guys delivered or contributed proposals to the budget bill that are just non-deliverables in his mind. What are some of the things that you guys were considering, and what have conversations been since that rejection?
I have no idea what the Speaker of the House of Representatives is talking about in terms of the budget or the spending agreement. At the end of the day, House Democrats believe that urgent action is needed to drive down the high cost of living in the United States of America and to protect Medicaid from the devastation that House Republicans are trying to bring to children, people with disabilities, and seniors in nursing homes and long-term care. House Democrats have made clear we're going to protect and defend Social Security and Medicare. We've also made clear that we will defend nutritional assistance to children, seniors, and veterans at a time when grocery prices are through the roof. Yet House Republicans want to take away nutritional assistance from everyday Americans who they promised to help and are doing everything to hurt.
Thank you, Mr. Leader. Next week, you all will be out on recess. It'll be an opportunity for you all to talk to your constituents and let them know what you all have been up to. What's the message going to be to your constituents? What's the expectation that you have of the members of the caucus to be connecting with their constituents, having events, really pushing forward the message that you've been pushing forward over these last few days?
Every opportunity to be back home in the district is a welcome opportunity to engage with the people that we are privileged to represent, to make it clear that House Democrats are fighting hard to drive down the high cost of living, secure the border, while defending dreamers, farm workers, and families, and make sure that we are keeping our communities safe. At the same time, the people of America are understandably alarmed at the parade of horribles and the extremism that is being relentlessly unleashed on the American people by this far-right administration. We were told that grocery prices were going to decline on day one of this administration. On January 20th, grocery prices were going to decline. Why hasn't that happened? In fact, costs are going up, they're not going down. As it relates to groceries, housing, consumer goods, and insurance. Republicans made a lot of promises last year. They spent a lot of time talking about lowering the high cost of living while running away from Project 2025 as if it didn't exist. This year, Republicans have spent all of their time implementing the most extreme parts of Project 2025 and have done nothing, nada, as it relates to the high cost of living. In fact, the Republican budget plan, which represents a betrayal of the American middle class and all those who aspire to be part of the middle class, will hurt working class Americans, hurt middle class Americans, and hurt everyday Americans, children, seniors, and veterans by devastating Medicaid. The Republican Party a few weeks ago promised to love and cherish Medicaid. Cutting Medicaid by close to $1 trillion is an example of loving and cherishing Medicaid. It's an extraordinary statement that was made, and Republicans are doing the exact opposite. In their budget markup right now.
This is an argument that you made and other Democrats made all last year, and the voters didn't go for it. Why should they think it's different? They didn't think Democrats could lower prices, do all these things. Is it just because you're going to say that the Republicans were lying now and Donald Trump was lying?
I think under the previous administration, progress was made in certain areas, particularly as it relates to the high cost of life-saving prescription drugs. But at the same time, it's also clear that so much more needs to be done. There is no debate that can be legitimately had in the United States of America as it relates to the cost of living. The cost of living for working families and middle-class Americans and seniors is far too high. The problem is that Republicans, despite all of their grandiose promises, have done nothing to lower the high cost of living. In fact, the cost of living is going up. With a Republican president, a Republican House, and a Republican Senate. Yes, that's a problem. And we will continue to be clear that in the absence of that changing, Republicans should be held accountable for their failure to deliver on improving the quality of life for everyday Americans.
What specific conditions are red lines for Democrats with regard to supporting a CR or a government funding measure on March 14th?
At this moment, there is no discussion because the Speaker of the House has apparently ordered House Republican appropriators to walk away from the negotiating table. They are marching America toward a reckless Republican shutdown. Second row.
Linda McMahon is testifying in the Senate today, and Trump has said he's interested in shutting down the Education Department. Despite not being in the majority, are there any specific plans from Senate or House Democrats to protect the Education Department going forward?
There are several members who will take the lead on this issue, including but not limited to Representative Jahana Hayes, Bobby Scott, the once and future chairman of the Education and Labor Community, Frederica Wilson, and other educators and leaders, including John Mannion, who all understand that public education is a precious part of what makes America, America. We have a responsibility and an obligation to stand up for our children, low-income children, working-class children, and middle-class children, all of whom would be hurt by the closure of the Department of Education. It's a reckless, foolish, and vicious suggestion, all at the same time. Here's the thing. The Department of Education can only be shut down legislatively because the Department of Education was established by an act of Congress. Where are the House Republicans to stand up for the people and the children and the teachers and the educators that they represent? Where are the House Republicans? They're missing in action on all of these fights, or actively supporting ending America in terms of our civility and unity as we know it. Where are the House Republicans? It's a question that should be asked of them. House Democrats are going to be united in this fight on any issue. It only takes 3 Republicans in the House to stop bad things from happening and to move forward legislatively so that we can get good things done for the American people. It only takes 3 House Republicans on any issue. These are questions that should be asked of the House Republican leadership, who are busy bending the knee to Donald Trump and Elon Musk.
Thanks, Mr. Leader. Your colleagues in the New York delegation have called Mayor Adams compromised, and that the president has him on a, quote, short leash because of the outstanding threat of charges being reinstated. Do you share those concerns?
Those are all legitimately held concerns that have been articulated by members of the congressional delegation. Most importantly, there are people in the communities that I represent back in Brooklyn who are deeply alarmed at the unfolding events connected to the current mayor of the city of New York.
So you think it's a legitimate fear that he is basically going to do the bidding of the White House?
I'll be back home in Brooklyn later on today, but what is clear is that the White House made a decision to dismiss the criminal charges pending against Mayor Adams without prejudice. Translation: it is the intention of the Trump administration to keep the current mayor on a short leash. How the mayor responds to the White House's intentions is going to determine a lot about the political future of the current mayor of the city of New York.
You said Republicans have walked away from the negotiating table regarding the budget bill, and Speaker Johnson seems confident that he can pass it with this caucus. Have there been any discussions within your own caucus about what concessions you would take should that dynamic change on the Republican side and he may need Democratic votes?
House Republicans have made a decision to walk away from the 4 corners discussions that involved House Democrats, Senate Democrats, and Senate Republicans related to funding the government in a manner that meets the needs of the American people. They have chosen to walk away, and they have a responsibility to govern in connection with March 14th and beyond.
How would you judge the Dems' messaging on DOGE and if it's been effective or not? And could there be the argument that you might be missing the will of the voters who support DOGE and might be too hung up on the process?
The American people are alarmed about the possibility that Elon Musk and his far-right extreme minions have access to their personal and financial information. Why in the world does Elon Musk need access to the names, addresses, birth dates, social security numbers, and bank account information of tens of millions of Americans? Why does he need access? What are they planning to do with that information? These are legitimate questions that House Democrats have been asking, and we're taking action to stop it, which is exactly why we introduced the Taxpayer Data Protection Act. Where are House Republicans as it relates to stopping the steal of taxpayer data? Where are House Republicans? It only takes 3 to join us, and we can move the Taxpayer Data Protection Act. I think we've been very clear in terms of the pushback that's taking place in the Congress, and we've been partnering with Democratic attorney generals, unions, advocacy groups, and democracy reform organizations as it relates to the litigation that has been filed that is successful to date in stopping the overreach and the unlawful, unconstitutional, and unconscionable power grab being led by an out-of-touch, unaccountable, and out-of-control billionaire puppet master.
Leader, I have a question about messaging as well. I don't know if you've seen the buzz building about Stephen A. Smith, the ESPN personality, and running for president. I'm wondering what you make of that and what you think it might say about how effectively Democrats are messaging at this time.
2028 is way off in the distance. House Democrats are engaged in an hour-by-hour, day-to-day, week-to-week struggle on behalf of the American people in the context of the first 100 days and beyond.
Do you think
There's a lot to like about Stephen A. Smith, including the fact that we are both diehard Knicks fans.
Leader Jeffries, in regards to Attorney General Pam Bondi's announcement yesterday, I want to get your perspective on the Department of Justice lawsuit against Governor Hochul, and what role do you think, if not just the New York congressional delegation, but Democrats in general, what kind of role do you think you need to play in addressing the tensions between state and federal immigration policies if they're going to overreach like this?
I have not had the opportunity to speak with Governor Hochul about this issue or Attorney General Tish James, but I expect that there will be a forceful response to this overreach by the Department of Justice. We will not be intimidated at all, ever, by the Trump administration and anything that these far-right extremists attempt to do to hurt New Yorkers or hurt the American people. We will not be intimidated. What in our record suggests, particularly as it relates to the House of Representatives, that this crowd over there will intimidate us? What in our record suggests that? What in 2017? What in 2018? What in 2019? What in 2020? What in 2021? What in 2022? What this year suggests that House Democrats are going to be intimidated by any of the extremism that is coming out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue? We're going to push back. We're going to push back forcefully. We will certainly defend the people of the great state of New York, and the American people. Last question.
As recently as yesterday, top appropriators were saying that talks were still going and that they were hopeful they could get a deal by March 14th. What changed?
That's a question that needs to be asked of the Speaker of the House of Representatives. They are in disarray over there. Senate Republicans are arguing with House Republicans. House Republicans are arguing with each other. House Republicans aren't clear, should they take orders from Donald Trump or Elon Musk or both? They are flailing over on the House Republican conference side and then trying to project otherwise. Yesterday, House Republicans walk away from the negotiating table. You've now shown America it's all on you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee.